Travis Merrick backed a sump pump to his pond and the neighbors laughed. The pond had been there 4 generations, muddy and pointless. He ignored them, kept the pump running until the water dropped low enough to reveal a curved bone wider than a man's thigh, anchored deep in the muck. What lay beneath would rewrite history, wipe out his debt, and make everyone wonder what else is buried. The man who fired up that pump was running out of options. Travis Merrick had inherited the family farm, but not the money to keep it. The pond out back, a 4-generation, murky joke, had never given anyone a single reason to look twice, until the pump jammed on something that was not a tree stump, and a 14,000-year-old secret put the entire county on notice. The sump pump had been chugging non-stop for 3 days when the first solid shape broke the surface. Not the familiar curve of a rusted barrel, not the splintered stub of an old fence post. A length of bone, curved and segmented, thicker than a man's thigh. Travis Merrick killed the motor and waded into the mud. He ran a palm along the arc, then pulled out his phone. He did not call a neighbor. He did not call a salvage yard. He called the geology department at the state university, and by sundown, a paleontology team was standing in his empty pond, staring at something they couldn't explain out loud yet. What they were looking at was the leading edge of a Columbian mammoth, a creature that last walked this ground when glaciers still covered half the continent. The farm sat in a wide, flat county whose prehistory had never been anything more than a footnote in a regional survey. 30 miles to the east, researchers had turned up scattered teeth and broken tusk fragments over the years, enough to confirm Ice Age megafauna passed through, but never anything complete. Never anything that made anyone rewrite a textbook. The consensus was that glacial scouring had ground most remains into splinters, leaving only what chance and deep burial could protect. Travis's pond, fed for generations by seeps that never froze, had done what the ice sheets could not. It had preserved a body in an oxygen-starved clay coffin, sealed and waiting. The first news crews pulled up before the team even had tarps over the site. The same neighbors who had laughed at the sump pump now stood at the fence line with coffee cups gone cold, watching graduate students trowel mud from bones that grew larger by the hour. By the second week, the excavation had revealed a skull, both tusks still curving outward in a final reach no living thing would witness, and a rib cage so intact the lead paleontologist, Dr. Alan Hensley, told a reporter the specimen would redefine what anyone believed about the region's Ice Age ecology. His exact words were "not 1 in 1,000." The county assessor quietly stopped sending tax delinquency notices. But it was what happened on day 17 that turned a spectacular fossil recovery into a story no one had seen coming. A graduate student working the sediment inside the chest cavity paused, her trowel hovering. She called Hensley over. Under the beam of a handheld lamp, embedded in the same gray clay that had held the mammoth's bones for 14 millennia, lay a shape that did not belong to any megafauna. A flint point, 4 inches long, flaked to a razor edge, and unmistakably the work of human hands. The flint point had been driven upward, between 2 ribs, with enough force to lodge against the inner face of the vertebral column. Hensley called in an archaeologist from the state university, a woman named Diane Ruiz who had spent 2 decades studying Clovis-era kill sites across the Southwest. She arrived within 24 hours, knelt at the edge of the excavation grid, and stared silently for a full minute before she spoke. When she did, her voice had the flat, controlled tone of someone trying very hard not to outrun her own data. The point did not match any Clovis technology she had ever seen. Clovis points have a distinctive flute, a shallow channel flaked away from the base to make hafting onto a spear shaft easier. This point had a different basal thinning, a style associated with sites that predate Clovis by thousands of years. If the association was real, if that point had been buried inside the mammoth's rib cage since the animal died, then humans were hunting Columbian mammoths in this part of the continent at least 2,000 years earlier than any textbook allowed. That was not a minor correction. That was a wholesale collapse of the timeline that structured an entire field. Word traveled through academic channels the way words travel through small towns with nothing to hide. Within a week, Dr. Hensley's phone was ringing with calls from researchers who wanted access to the site, offers from museums eager to house the specimen, and one very pointed inquiry from a federal agency with jurisdiction over paleontological resources that had, until now, never shown any interest in a drained farm pond. Suddenly, the quiet excavation behind the Merrick family fence was the most scrutinized patch of clay in the country. Travis Merrick had thought his biggest problem was a lien on the property. Now he stood in his own yard watching scientists argue over the legal definition of culturally modified bone, while his county tax bill sat unsolved in a kitchen drawer. The finder's reward structure for vertebrate fossils on private land is notoriously murky. In many states, fossils belong to the surface owner, but cultural artifacts that predate European contact fall under an entirely different legal code. If the flint point counted as an artifact, and if the mammoth qualified as a culturally significant context, the whole excavation might be reclassified, the bones potentially removed from his ownership, and any reward dependent on an interagency review process that could drag on for years. Hensley and Ruiz both pushed for controlled, peer-reviewed analysis before anything got locked away in a museum basement. Hensley saw a once-in-a-career paleontological opportunity. Ruiz saw a site that could overturn the peopling of the Americas debate. Travis saw a backhoe-sized question mark parked in his back lot, surrounded by fencing someone else had paid for, while property tax interest kept accruing on a house he could not afford to lose. The first carbon dates came back from the lab during the fourth week of the dig. The sediment directly encasing the mammoth bones returned an age of 14,500 years, give or take 200 years. That put the mammoth squarely in the window before Clovis technology appears anywhere in North America. The flint point, embedded in bone that had not been disturbed since deposition, was now, by direct association, a pre-Clovis artifact. Ruiz could barely contain the implications in her field notebook. She started using the phrase "kill site" in official updates. But here is where the story takes a turn that no one saw coming, least of all the two scientists who had invested their reputations in the excavation. While cataloging the sediment around the rib cage, a graduate student recovered a second object lodged deeper in the clay matrix, a fragment of what appeared to be worked bone, polished along one edge, with a series of parallel grooves cut into its surface. It did not look like a tool. It looked like a tally mark. It looked, under magnification, like someone had made a deliberate, patterned incision into a piece of mammoth rib, possibly cut from the very same animal. Ruiz sent high-resolution photographs to 3 colleagues at other institutions, without telling them what else had been found. All 3 came back with the same unsettling observation. The marks were almost certainly decorative, too regular to be butchering damage, and they resembled nothing found at any known pre-Clovis site in the hemisphere. One of the colleagues, a specialist in early symbolic behavior, sent Ruiz an email she read 3 times before closing her laptop. The email said, "If this is genuine, it pushes back evidence of abstract representation on this continent by 6,000 years. You had better be sure." That night, Hensley posted a security guard at the excavation for the first time, not because he feared looters, because he realized this was no longer a simple fossil recovery. Something had happened beside that ancient watering hole, something involving a weapon, a mammoth, and a human being who, after the kill, sat down and carved a message into a bone fragment that no one alive had ever been meant to read. The security guard arrived at dusk, a retired county deputy named Stu who spent most of his shift drinking vending machine coffee and watching headlights crawl along the gravel road. By midnight, he had chased off 2 teenagers with a flashlight and a voice that suggested he meant it. By morning, Travis Merrick opened his front door to find not a curious neighbor, but a man in a pressed shirt holding a federal identification card. The man introduced himself as a compliance officer with the Army Corps of Engineers. Someone in town, someone who had never stopped thinking the pond was a joke, had filed a formal complaint. Draining a pond that fed into a seasonal creek without a permit, the officer explained, could constitute an unauthorized discharge under the Clean Water Act. The penalty schedule started at tens of thousands of dollars and climbed fast if the violation was deemed knowing. Travis had never asked permission. It had never occurred to him that a farm pond, one his great-grandfather had dug with a mule team, needed the blessing of the federal government. Suddenly, the tax debt he thought would swallow him looked almost manageable compared to the fine schedule the officer left on his kitchen table. The excavation became a legal anomaly. The science team was allowed to continue working only because the site had already been disturbed, and because pausing mid-excavation risked damaging a resource the state had formally designated as significant. But the core investigation idled overhead like a storm that refused to break. Every new discovery inside the grid added weight to a file that would ultimately decide whether the man who uncovered the century's most important paleontological find was a local hero or a defendant in a federal enforcement action. 1,000 miles to the west, a different kind of storm was gathering. The Clovis First paradigm had dominated North American archaeology for half a century. It held that the first humans arrived on this continent roughly 13,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge from Siberia and funneling south through an ice-free corridor before spreading across the hemisphere with a distinctive fluted projectile point. For decades, any claim of an earlier presence was met with withering scrutiny, buried under methodological objections, accused of sloppy excavation, misdated strata, or artifact misidentification. The Merrick site was now the most dangerous threat to that orthodoxy, since a site in Chile called Monte Verde had forced a grudging retreat in the 1990s. But Monte Verde was far away, its pre-Clovis evidence based on wooden stakes and hearth ash, not on a stone point lodged directly in the rib cage of the planet's most iconic Ice Age animal. This was different. This was a kill site with a weapon in situ. And the carved bone, if it held up, would not only prove humans were here earlier, it would prove they were making symbolic objects thousands of years before anyone thought possible. The counterattack began with a quote in a national science magazine. A senior archaeologist from a major university, one who had built his entire career on the Clovis First model, told a reporter he had serious reservations about the stratigraphic integrity of a site that sat at the bottom of an artificial pond until last month. He noted that pond drainage can shift sediment, that bioturbation from roots and burrowing animals can move small artifacts, and that the flint point could easily have worked its way down from a much later occupation level. He demanded independent access to the excavation and called for the specimens to be removed to a neutral laboratory for verification. Ruiz read the article, closed her laptop, and spent the next 3 hours rechecking every profile wall in the grid. The sediment boundaries were clean. The bone the point was lodged in had never been displaced. She knew the Clovis establishment would not go quietly. What she did not yet know was that the site was about to give her more ammunition than she had ever asked for. The ground-penetrating radar team arrived on a Tuesday morning with a sled-mounted antenna and a quiet, methodical approach that made everyone on site stop what they were doing and watch. Over the next 2 days, they dragged that sled across every square meter of the drain pond bed, bouncing signals into the clay and reading the reflections that came back. The preliminary map showed the skeleton everyone already knew about, a massive blob of bone-shaped anomalies radiating outward from the center of the basin. But it also showed something else. 8 meters to the east, a second cluster of large, intact bones sat at the same depth, arranged in a pattern that looked unmistakably like a second mammoth lying on its side. And 3 meters beyond that, a smaller set of anomalies formed a tight oval that the radar operator pointed to with the cap of his pen and said 2 words no one was ready for. Possible cranium. A human skull, or something very like it, rested at the same level as the mammoths, separated from the second skeleton by less than the length of a spear throw. The discovery of a single mammoth with a weapon in its ribs had been enough to rattle a field. The discovery of a possible human burial, in direct association with multiple mammoths, would do something that had not happened in North American archaeology since the discovery of the first Clovis point embedded in an extinct bison at Folsom in 1927. It would reopen the question of who the first Americans actually were, and the answer would no longer fit inside the tidy migration model that every textbook had treated as settled fact. The carved bone fragment landed on the desk of a specialist named Corinne Atwell, who worked at a laboratory that studied early human cognition through material culture. She imaged it under a scanning electron microscope and spent 4 days mapping the groove patterns with a precision that bordered on obsessive. The findings stopped her midway through a peer-reviewed draft. The grooves were not random. They were not even simply decorative. The spacing between the parallel lines corresponded to intervals that, when projected against the known position of the night sky 14,500 years ago, aligned with the star cluster known as the Pleiades. Atwell sent Ruiz a single sentence. They were charting the sky. The people who killed that mammoth, who possibly buried one of their own beside it, were not just surviving. They were observing, remembering, and encoding knowledge in a medium durable enough to outlast every language that would ever be spoken on the continent they called home. The pond basin, it turned out, was not just a pond basin. It was a filled-in kettle hole, a depression left behind when a block of glacial ice melted at the end of the last ice age. The clay that had preserved the mammoth bones also preserved a layer of ancient pollen, tiny grains that told the story of what the landscape looked like when the first humans walked into it. That landscape was not the barren, windswept tundra that long-standing models had described. It was a mixed forest of spruce and alder, broken by open meadows, rich with the kind of plant life that supports not just mammoths but the people who hunt them. One core sample, taken from the very center of the dig, rewrote the paleo-environmental history of the entire county in an afternoon. The excavation had started as a local joke and a tax problem. It had become a federal case, a scientific revolution, and a window into a world that no one knew still existed beneath the pastures and gravel roads of a place the glaciers were supposed to have scrubbed clean. Every answer the team found raised a question that was bigger than the one before it. And hanging over all of it, still unresolved, was the quiet question Travis Merrick had been asking since the moment the pump first jammed. Would the thing he uncovered save his farm, or would it bury him in ways he never saw coming? The Army Corps of Engineers closed its file on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after it opened. A hydrological survey paid for by the museum proved what Travis Merrick had always known at a gut level. The pond his great-grandfather dug with a mule team was an isolated basin, fed by a shallow seeping spring, disconnected from any creek and certainly from any federally regulated waterway. The compliance officer packed his paperwork into a leather satchel, told Travis the complaint had been filed by a disgruntled neighbor who no longer answers his phone, and drove off the farm without issuing a single penalty. The tax debt, which had loomed over Travis like a storm front since his father died, vanished a month later. A consortium of 3 museums, led by the Smithsonian, finalized a finder's reward that covered every unpaid dollar on the property, every lien, every late notice, with enough left over to put a new roof on the farmhouse and finally fix the leaning porch. Travis kept the farm. Against every expectation he had carried into that dry September, he got to stay. The peer-reviewed papers dropped together in a single issue of a major journal, and the impact registered like a seismic wave through the discipline. Diane Ruiz published the mammoth kill site data with meticulous stratigraphic cross-sections, radiocarbon tables, and the flint point photographed from 17 angles under controlled lighting. Alan Hensley published the skeletal analysis, noting that the Columbian mammoth was a mature bull with healed fractures in 2 ribs, an animal that had survived at least one prior encounter with something sharp long before the spear that killed it. Corinne Atwell published the carved bone and its astronomical alignment, laying out the groove measurements against computer models of the terminal Pleistocene sky and concluding, with the cautious understatement of a scientist who knows she is writing for history, that symbolic representation in North America now extends into a temporal range that demands a fundamental revision of human cognitive evolution on the continent. The paper that broke the Clovis first model was not a polemic. It was a map of a bone. It did not need to attack anyone. The data did the damage. The human remains, once fully exposed, told a story that no one had been prepared to hear. The cranium belonged to a female, roughly 20 years old at death, interred in a tightly flexed position with her hands placed near her face. A second worked bone fragment rested beside her skull, this one polished into a crescent shape and pierced with a hole that suggested it had been worn as a pendant. The body had been laid down with care, not discarded in a hunting camp midden but buried deliberately in the same clay that held the mammoths, a choice that implied a relationship between hunter and hunted that no previous model had accounted for. Genetic testing later confirmed something even more startling. Her mitochondrial DNA carried markers shared by modern indigenous communities in the Great Lakes region, a direct genetic thread spooling across 14 millennia that connected the earliest known inhabitants of this landscape to people still living on it today. When the findings were shared with tribal representatives, the conversation shifted. This was not a fossil display. This was ancestral land, and the science was now accountable to descendants who had every right to decide what happened next. The museum opened 18 months after the last trowel was stored. The exhibit filled an entire hall, centered on the fully articulated bull mammoth, its tusks curving into the skylight, the flint point mounted beside it at the angle it had rested inside the rib cage. The carved bone fragment, less than 7 inches long, sat in its own case under climate-controlled glass, and visitors who had never heard of Clovis or pre-Clovis shuffled past it in quiet, absorbing the placard that explained they were looking at the oldest known astronomical notation in the Western Hemisphere. Behind the main hall, a smaller room held the replica burial and the crescent pendant, accompanied by a statement co-written with tribal historians. It simply said, "She lived here. She was loved. She is still here." The same neighbors who once laughed from their truck windows now bring their grandchildren to peer over the fence at the crater, which Travis left open at the museum's request as a teaching site. School buses from 3 counties make the trip every spring. The farm that was once a local joke is now a destination, and the quiet question everyone asks while standing at the fence line is the same one Travis whispered to himself the day the sump pump first choked on something that did not belong. What else is still buried out here, waiting for someone willing to drain the pond everyone said to ignore? Every piece of ground that gets dismissed as worthless, every muddy pond, overgrown field, and forgotten corner of a property that nobody has looked at twice, is only one decision away from becoming the most important discovery in a generation. Travis Merrick spent his whole life driving past a hole in the ground his father told him to leave alone. He drained it anyway, not because he expected to find a mammoth, but because he had run out of reasons not to try. What waited beneath the muck did more than pay his debts. It rewrote history, cracked open a scientific orthodoxy, and connected descendants to an ancestor they never knew existed. All because one man refused to accept that a thing everyone had labeled pointless was actually finished. Most people will never drain a pond. Most people will never pull a 14,000-year-old spear point out of a rib cage. But everyone alive has stood in front of something the world told them was not worth the effort and felt that quiet pull to look closer. The people who change things, who find the mammoths, who build something out of rotten apples or turn a joke into a legacy, are the ones who stop the truck instead of driving past. They are the ones who back the pump into the water before they fully understand what they are looking for. If this story reminded you that the most overlooked things are sometimes the most extraordinary, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments about a moment you ignored conventional wisdom and found something unexpected. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that curiosity is never wasted. And as always, let us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. The next story is already waiting underneath something someone else decided to ignore.